This is United for Biodiversity, the Alliance podcast, a platform that unites global voices in a call to action to protect our planet's rich biodiversity. Join us for critical insights and let's stand united for biodiversity.
Welcome to another episode of United for Biodiversity, the Alliance podcast. I am your host, Kiana Woolberg. Over the past few weeks, we have had the discussion on the importance of protecting biodiversity from various vantage points. But today we place the spotlight on the importance of data to this conversation. To help us with today's discussion is a very important guest, Dr. Claire Hoffmann, Head of Partnerships at Yale Center for Biodiversity and Global Change. Dr. Hoffmann, welcome to our podcast and thank you so much for participating today.
So much for having me, Kiana. It's a real honor to be part of this podcast series and to be part of the Global Biodiversity Alliance and the summit as a whole. We're really excited.
Thank you so much. I know our audience is excited to hear from you, so I'm going to jump straight into our questions. Now, as I noted, we've had a discussion over the past few weeks regarding biodiversity, but one of the important topics or elements that's critical to this is data. Now, we often hear about the need for powerful or effective policies that ensure action is taken to safeguard green assets. But how critical is data to this discussion?
Sure. I think that data is essential to this discussion, really. There is a reason that we have an entire target in the Global Biodiversity Framework, Target 21, that specifically focuses on the importance of really good biodiversity information. The Convention on Biological Diversity specifically notes that this target is relevant to the attainment of every single one of the goals and targets in the Global Biodiversity Framework. And if we really dig into the language of that target, it kind of helps us figure out why that data is so important, and in what capacities. So I think first off, the target talks about the best available data, making sure that we have really good quality data. And we have to ensure that the data we're using to support our decisions is actually really trustworthy. There are a lot of sources of trustworthy knowledge and information out there. We're not just talking about highly rigorous scientific data, although of course that's the kind that we like to provide from our center at Yale. But we also know that there's hugely valuable and trustworthy information in the hands and minds of people and communities and institutions around the world. But we have to be really intentional about what kind of knowledge we apply and in which situations.
Dr. Hoffmann, are there any common pitfalls or oversights when incorporating data into these types of discussions?
Yeah, I think the text of that target again points at maybe one of the biggest ones that we often see, which is that the information really has to be accessible. So here we like to differentiate between having data present and available versus having data that's actually accessible and relevant to the decisions that need to be made. So we'll often see the production or the collection of data from sources around the world that actually isn't relevant to the decisions that need to be made on the ground. And in some other cases, we end up in situations where there's really wonderful knowledge, but it's not accessible to the people that actually need it to make decisions. So really great data that stays on a hard drive somewhere doesn't move us forward as a collective. It doesn't help address the need that we have for good data. So we had to be really careful about creating tools and relationships and initiatives like the Global Biodiversity Alliance that bring that data out into the world in a way that is both accessible and effective.
I want to touch on that word that you mentioned there about tools. And your center at Yale is actually helping Guyana build a very important tool in the form of a National Biodiversity Information System. Tell us a bit more about this particular tool and what are some of the best practices you've seen globally that can help us make it really transformative.
Sure, that is a perfect segue, right? So the National Biodiversity Information System, or the NBIS, as we call it, is a tool that's specifically designed to get really good quality biodiversity data into the hands of practitioners and decision makers across Guyana and across different scales of management in the country in a way that's really decision relevant. There are two key components for the NBIS: the data infrastructure behind the scenes and then the front end user interface. So The data infrastructure is really important, but it's probably the least sexy aspect from a communication standpoint. But this is where we get at that really good quality data. Our data infrastructure ensures that the Government of Guyana has a safe and secure cloud-based system that allows access to all of the global biodiversity information that we provide in our center and our center's flagship mapping program called the Map of Life. But it also ensures that they have a secure portal to maintain their own data. Data ownership and data sovereignty and data management can stay in the hands of the agencies or the collaborators of the Government of Guyana. We do all of the work to make sure that their data can match up with ours, which is a really big deal in the biodiversity world, right? Making sure that your species names match ours, for example, and that we can use all of that collective data to support decision-making at various scales across the country. And then the second piece of it, the user interface, we've co-designed with partners to make sure that the data is really accessible. So we've created a series of pages on the NBIS on a dashboard system that's the user interface to help people access information on everything from individual species habitat loss and gain, all the way up to national trends in global biodiversity information or global biodiversity framework indicators, And with all that in mind, I think to be transformative, we also need to be thinking across scales, right? So we've ensured that the data infrastructure behind the scenes is modular and scalable. And we also want to make sure that the application and the integration of more data is also at different scales. So we need to be really strategic about filling in data gaps on the ground through additional biodiversity monitoring programs. Guyana is doing an amazing job on this front already. We've worked with a lot of the teams that are collecting data on the ground to make sure it's ingested into our system ahead of the summit. But we can also provide some information to help prioritize future programs to make them more efficient. And then we need to be thinking all the way up to potentially adding in additional countries using the same system, using the NBIS, so that we can look at all of the countries that share a species, for example, and support collective strategy development on conservation for that species, or engagement with markets that are based off of global biodiversity patterns beyond the borders of just Guyana. So really thinking across all of the different scales of data and application.
That is truly a groundbreaking initiative, and I know that once it truly gets into the landscape and we're using that, it's really going to enrich the discussions that we're having. So I'm excited to see, how that plays out. But let's shift the discussion a bit to partnerships, because while data is important, so too is partnerships in the biodiversity space. How can we ensure that collaboration is not just transactional, but it's also transformational?
I love this question, right? Because we can provide all the data in the world, and if we don't actually have the partnerships to make that meaningful, it's a waste of effort. My answer is really simple in theory and complex in practice. It's equity in partnership in those collaborations. This means true co-development of tools, co-design of initiatives, co-collection of data. It means sitting down and actually figuring out what everyone's goals, capacities, and interests are and putting them on a really even playing field. The biodiversity field as a whole has way too long of a history of inequity in knowledge and data in conservation and in practice on the ground. And we have to be able to move past that pattern at this stage. In the case of the collaboration that we have with Guyana, that has meant truly listening to the potential use cases of our data and of our tools, and the potential benefits of a partnership for the governments and communities in Guyana. Right? We could walk into this collaboration as scientists with some idea of what those uses might be, what we might hope they would be, but we really have to be willing to be open to alternatives that will actually drive transformational collaboration and impact on the ground. And then I think it means personal connections. Creating the space to learn who your partners are as people and not just as professionals, letting all of our very human interests and passions lead us and connect us. And in all honesty, that's my favorite part of my job. The opportunity to sit down and get to know people all over the world who see and experience the world very differently than I do, but to still be able to connect through our shared passion for biodiversity and figure out what those unique perspectives can each add on their own to create some sort of bigger collective transformational output. And the human part of it is pretty magic. And I think that we have to keep that at the center. We can't forget that piece.
Thank you, Dr. Hoffman. Now, Guyana has a wealth of biodiversity, rich biodiversity profile. And for years, as a small country, we have been making a difference in our own way. But with a relatively small population, how do we get international partnerships now to amplify the local voices who are part of this biodiversity fight?
This is another wonderful question, and I'm really glad you're asking it, because I think it's really important going into all of the conversations that we'll be having at the summit. Um, and I think the answer comes from how you define amplification. I think that international partners would be doing all of you in Guyana and the world as a whole a huge disservice by standing in front of you and repeating what you've said. I think instead we need to be standing next to or behind you, and adding power to your message. This requires a lot of intentionality and very careful communication on our part. And in many cases, I think this also means being willing to amplify the nuance of lived experience around the world. Again, we all come bringing our own perspectives and views and experiences in the world, and we have to be willing to amplify a perspective or a narrative that is different from what we would have picked for ourselves. Regardless of the fact that I work in a biodiversity research center, I am very aware of the fact that a lot more goes into biodiversity decision making than just biodiversity. We have to be willing to stand with you when you talk about the importance of development and infrastructure and growth alongside conservation. And we have to be willing to let you all tell us what is important and then stand behind it. We can't stand in front and then filter through our own lens of what all of this should look like and how it should play out.
Thank you for that, Dr. Hoffman. So we've discussed the importance of data, we've discussed the importance of partnerships, but I want to touch on another important factor or element in this equation, and that's building trust. How do we begin to build trust in biodiversity collaborations, especially between countries in the global north and those in the south?
This is the million or perhaps $1 billion question. There's no doubt that there is a lot of history in the biodiversity space in particular that could cause us to start from a position of lack of trust. And it is our responsibility of representatives of the part of the world that has historically taken advantage of the rest of it to invest in trust building before anything else. There is no simple answer to this question, I don't think. I'm going to try to simplify it. But it's very similar to my answer to the last question, that we need to prove that we won't steamroll by listening to what our partners actually want and need, and then not trying to overwrite that with what we think you should want and need. This is a lesson that I learned, unfortunately, very firsthand during graduate school when I was doing my PhD research, and I was working in East Africa doing conservation work in Tanzania with community members. And I went into that experience having read every single academic paper there was on conservation in East Africa. And I showed up on the ground and thought I knew what the conversations were going to look like and what the needs and interests and benefits were going to be of the work I was trying to do. And very, very quickly, through just a couple conversations with people, learned that actually their lived experience was not reflected in the academic literature. And I had a very filtered perspective on what was actually going on and what would be beneficial to conservation in that space and in the world as a whole, to be honest. That coming from an academic institution like Yale, we stand on a really strong platform of academic rigor, which is really important, but it is not a full representation of the complexity of the world and of conservation and how it has to work. And I think we have a responsibility to look past what has been filtered into our parts of the world and instead enter collaborations and relationships with space having already been created on our side to listen and hear what is needed and wanted and go from there. And that initial effort of trust has to come from us. And I feel very strongly about that.
Thank you, Dr. Hoffmann. To close, I want to invite you to provide us with a bit more of a personal perspective. Your center at Yale is providing us with extensive support to help us advance our efforts in the biodiversity fight. But what excites you most about the road ahead for Guyana, particularly as we balance conservation with rapid economic development?
Yes, there is a lot to be excited about. I personally, and then our center as a whole, we're really excited to be part of this whole initiative. I think if I had to distill it down to one answer, it would be that I'm incredibly excited to see what Guyana's leadership can do for the rest of the world. It's amazing to see a country that has resources, both natural and financial, to truly take a global leadership role in the biodiversity space and do something really different with it. This alliance, the Global Biodiversity Alliance, and the summit itself are a really wonderful representation of how Guyana intends to lead in this space, with evidence as represented by a lot of what we are bringing along with some other partners, but also with collaboration and intentionality and interdisciplinarity, maybe is the best word for it. There's a very clear goal coming out of this alliance and this summit. And they have brought together representatives from a huge range of countries and fields and industries and positions to be part of the launch of this and the brainstorming of the details of what it could look like. I think that the different cultures and perspectives that will be represented at the summit and in the alliance is unlike anything I have really seen up to this point. And it brings together that human element that I keep harping on, right? That there will be lots of different views there, and Guyana is providing space for them to be represented and all woven together to create this amazing initiative. And I am excited to see what this collaborative approach can do for setting the stage for how the rest of the world looks forward to our 2030 targets and beyond. I think there's a lot of really exciting opportunity coming out of it.
Dr. Hoffmann, I want to thank you so much for powering our podcast today with such thought-provoking insights. It was truly a pleasure and an honor engaging you today, and we look forward to welcoming you at the Global Biodiversity Alliance Summit in a few days.
Thank you so much. It's really wonderful to speak with you today, and I'm excited for all the additional conversations that are coming soon.
Thanks again. Take care.
Thank you.
To our audience, thank you as well for following us. We will be bringing you more insights regarding Guyana's push to ensure there are like-minded individuals part of this fight to protect the world's biodiversity. I'm Kiana Wilberg, and I'll see you next time.
Thank you for listening to United for Biodiversity, the Alliance podcast. Be sure to follow us for more insightful episodes on our Spotify, LinkedIn, and Facebook accounts.